Professor Loch K. Johnson is America's leading scholar on U.S. intelligence, an author and a professor of political science at the University of Georgia, where his research interests are the U.S. presidency, Congress, and national security policy. Johnson's expertise lies in the activities of U.S. intelligence agencies. As the Phi Beta Kappa scholar for the 2008-2009 academic year, he'll be making several 2- or 3-day visits to various American universities. Very pleased to have him here at Brigham Young University today. 3 of his books, A Season of Inquiry, America's Secret Power, and Secret Agencies, display a comprehensive grasp of U.S. intelligence. In 1988, he received the Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Award, the University of Georgia's highest honor for instructors, and he's a recipient of the William A. Owens Award. He was also instrumental in the founding of the School of Public and International Affairs. Professor Johnson received his Ph.D. in political science from the University of California, Riverside. He was one of our main keynotes at a conference last winter, a year ago, Spies in Film and Fiction, which is available online and on iTunes for free. I would encourage you to, if you haven't already, take advantage to hear Professor Johnson's presentation as well as the other presentations that were delivered. It was a wonderful conference and a very interesting series of perspectives and insights and papers. The papers were published in the Journal of Intelligence and National Security, which was guest edited by our own Professor Stan Taylor. Professor Johnson is the editor of the journal, and in fact, as a plug, a reason why you should get involved in student organizations, he was kind enough to spend his lunch hour today with a group of Kennedy Center student officers from Sigma Iota Rho, CISA, the Kennedy Center Student Council, Solace, talking to them about how to get ready to publish papers in academic journals and how to prepare best for graduate school. So we're just very thrilled to have Professor Johnson here speaking about national security and the 2008 presidential election. I know a topic that's on all of our minds. Please join me in welcoming Professor Loch Johnson.
Thank you so much. I just came from the U.S. Military Academy, where the podium is rather different than this one. They have a podium that has an enormous eagle on it, and it reminded me of a podium that was in a chapel on a military base when I was a little boy. My father was in the U.S. Army, and I went to the chapel one morning, and with my little buddy, we sat in the front pew, and we had a brand new minister that day. And he came down the aisle with his black robes flowing behind him, and we were quite excited to see what he was going to be like. And as he passed by us, even though we were about 8 years old, we knew enough about the world from going to the officers' club with our parents on occasion to realize that this man reeked of the aroma of Jack Daniels. Now, this isn't exactly what we were expecting. And he got up behind this podium, which with the eagle on it, and he grasped the wings of that eagle, and he was swaying back and forth, and he launched into his sermon, and he said, "And Moses said," and he squinted and looked out at us, and he wavered some more, "And Moses said," and then he said, "If this damn bird had quit flapping its wings, I'd tell you what Moses said." Well, as you can imagine, that was his first and last sermon on that base. I'm so thrilled to be here, and Corey, I thank you for the very fine introduction, and I thank you for that lovely prayer as well. I'm always thrilled to be at BYU. It's got to be the most beautiful campus in this country. And at the university level, we concern ourselves with teaching, service, and research. And having been a student here myself at one time, I know there's no better place in the world when it comes to teaching. I've been at a number of universities, and I've never seen teaching done as well as it's done here, and Stan Taylor is a good example of that. Service, well, can you outdo the Mormon Church when it comes to public service in the community? Of course you can't. And there's a lot of great research that goes on here, too. So this place is a remarkable institution, and I feel honored to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit about the 2008 election, and I think what I would do is begin with the nation's early history, at least for a few minutes. And what I want to remind you is that even back then, we faced a number of perils when it came to national security. We were a fledgling democracy, and it wasn't easy to get the Republic started. One thinks, of course, of the infamous burning of the Capitol and the White House during the War of 1812 as an example of how perilous our life was. In fact, I have a feeling that were it not for Napoleon, we would have been in big trouble, but Napoleon was such a distraction for the British that they finally left us alone. So things were tough even in those early days, but imagine what we face today. The Russian Federation has the capacity today, as it did during the Cold War, to extinguish our entire society in a 30-minute witch fire of a nuclear holocaust. Now, fortunately, I don't think they have that in mind, and our relations, even though not great with the Russian Federation, are certainly better than they were at many points during the Cold War. But it gives you an idea of the awesome weaponry that's around the world. The Chinese have a similar capacity if they wanted to use it against us. Now, if either of those countries ever did that, they would, of course, find the favor would be returned, but that wouldn't be particularly comforting to us at that stage, with America looking like a Kmart. Do you have Kmart out here? A Kmart parking lot at 4 o'clock in the morning. And even now, as you know, the North Koreans have missiles that are capable of striking our west coast, maybe as far as Utah. And one day we'll have missiles that could strike any part of the United States. So one constant from our history is the danger that America faces. There were some pre-lapsarians at the end of the Cold War who thought maybe we could have an era of global peace, a new world order, as some phrased it. But the realists understood that the world remained uncertain and filled with menace, which we now know to be the case. On the election front, if you go back to the early days of the country, think how simple things were there with only a few elites picking our president. And now the marathon that we've evolved and we're putting our candidates through. Today, one must be very talented not only in raising money, but in organizing at caucus level and appearing on television effectively for the primary states. And of course, this election this year seems to be going on forever. I don't particularly like the 6-week duration of the British elections. I personally think maybe that's a little bit too short. I like the opportunity we have for looking over these candidates and seeing how they behave under the fire of primaries and caucuses and television interviews and debates. I've lost track of how many debates there are, although I think I've seen every one of them. But maybe it goes on too long, and maybe we're going to have to go back to the drawing board and readjust the way we select our leaders. So certainly if menace in the world has been a constant, on the election side, things have changed dramatically. It's a much more open process, a much more democratic process, which I think is a good thing. It's in the spirit of what we stand for, and that is people being involved in the selection of their leaders. A couple of things have, in addition, remained constant. Let's go for a moment into the minds of that great founder, James Madison. And he had a brilliant insight. It wasn't exactly original, but he was wise enough to understand the importance of the insight, which he and his colleagues borrowed from John Locke and Montesquieu and a couple of other philosophers of the time. That insight was that power concentrated into the hands of one individual is extremely dangerous. And I imagine there are people in this room who could quote Lord Acton for me. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Or as a friend of mine in Washington puts it, power corrupts and absolute power is a lot of fun. And I think Lord Acton was exactly right. And the great insight of the founders was to figure out how to avoid concentrating that power, which might end up being misused and directed against the people of America in an improper fashion. After all, they'd been through the experience of George III. No more George III's, thank you. One was enough. So let's make sure we don't concentrate power. Let's divide it. Let's put it in 3 departments of government. And that's exactly what the plan was. Their great gift to every person in this room was the safeguards that they built into our Constitution against the concentration of power and its potential abuse. But of course, it has a downside. Because once you begin to fragment power, you run into the problem of inefficiencies. Now, if you listen to Louis Brandeis, the great Supreme Court Justice, he famously remarked that the founders weren't that interested in efficiencies. That's not the value that they put foremost in their minds when they were meeting in Philadelphia. They had a different value in mind, and that value was liberty, preventing the rise of an autocracy in America. But I doubt if there's anyone in this room, certainly I wouldn't, I doubt if there's anyone in this room who would like to have an inefficient government that can't ever accomplish the goals of the American people. So on the one hand, clearly we value liberty. We don't want government misused against us any more than James Madison did. But on the other hand, we'd also like to have a government that works well. And therein lies the dilemma of governance in America. How can we have the efficiencies we seek, but also maintain the liberty that we all want? Another constant in our government has been the difference between elections and governing. It's one thing to win an election, and of course George Washington did that rather handily, given the great heroic status he had. And it's quite a different thing to govern, because as soon as you begin to start governing, you run into the Madisonian blueprint in our Constitution. And the fact that you don't have all the power in your hands, even though you're the President of the United States and the most powerful person on the face of the earth, with a telephone that you can use to release thousands of 1 megaton nuclear warheads that could annihilate any possible foe. Even though you have that power, you find that there are the Madisonian limits on how it might be used. And indeed, some people argue today that we don't just have fragmentation of power into 3 departments, but what we have is hyper-pluralism, of devolution of power even into bureaucratic agencies and into committees and subcommittees of Congress, vanishing like quicksilver from the control of any one person. Why, even the Pentagon is an overwhelming institution. Do you know of any Secretary of Defense who has properly and fully and adequately managed the Department of Defense? No, you don't, because there never has been such a person. The place is a behemoth sprawling along the Potomac River with very few secretaries running more than a small portion of it. So imagine the task facing the President of the United States, who must deal not only with the Pentagon, but all the other bureaucratic agencies. Our 3 candidates, it's turning out, are McCain, Obama, and Mrs. Clinton. And I think we recognize that ideologically speaking, McCain is on the right, perhaps right-center, although if you look at his ADA scores, this is a measure of how conservative one is in the Senate, you'll find his ratings are almost 0, sometimes up to 15. He is a bona fide conservative, even though a lot of bona fide conservatives seem unwilling to acknowledge that because of a couple of votes that he took that they disagree with. But he's certainly at least right of center. And then we have Mrs. Clinton, who I would argue at least would be a left of center, probably not too much. I think she's basically a centrist. She's styled herself in that manner. So we certainly have a choice between those 2 people. And then here comes Obama, who is clearly a liberal Democrat. I thought they vanished, but there is at least one still around, and apparently a lot more than one, because he's got quite a following. A liberal Democrat as measured by these ADA voting scores in Congress, where he gets a record of almost 100 all the time, compared to McCain's 0. And Mrs. Clinton, somewhere in the middle there. Barry Goldwater in 1964 complained that America always has an echo and never a choice. And he was going to give the American electorate a choice, a strong conservative that they could rally behind. Well, unfortunately for him, at least back in '64, apparently that's not the choice they wanted. But we certainly have choices this year, which is not always the case. Sometimes the two-party candidates look like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, two bottles of wine, both empty. But not this year. And I think that's healthy to have that kind of a choice. But you know, regardless of which one of these three people we select, they are all going to run into some problems in common. And that's what I want to talk about for a minute, a little bit. I want to talk about the frustrations one finds, particularly in the national security domain, upon becoming President of the United States. I don't care if you're right of center, in the middle, or left of center. So what I'm really talking to you about for a few moments is the irony of power at the presidential level. You may know the famous quote from Harry Truman, thinking about Eisenhower coming into office. And Truman said, here's this five-star general, and he'll come into the Oval Office and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. And there's a fair amount of truth to that. I remember when John Kennedy came into office, and he noticed or his brother noticed, the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, when driving to work at the Justice Department, that there was a sign out on the Washington Parkway, and it said, Central Intelligence Agency, next right. And Kennedy thought that was kind of crazy to have a secret intelligence agency with a sign telling you where it was. So Bobby Kennedy told John Kennedy, let's get that sign down. Kennedy called up the director of Central Intelligence and asked him to take the sign down. 3 weeks later, it was still there. 6 weeks later, it was still there. Finally, it took the president himself to actually go out there. I think he was doing other business too, but while he was out at the CIA, he insisted that sign be taken down. I remember in the Carter administration, there was a peculiar odor in the Oval Office beyond any personnel matters. And we discovered that there was probably a mouse, as far as we could tell, in the wall. And so Jimmy Carter himself, remember he used to love to micromanage the White House, called up a few people and said, come over here and get this mouse out of the wall. It took weeks to get it out because the GSA said it wasn't their job, it was the Interior Department's job, and so on. So as public administration scholars have told us in their rich literature, there is a lot of resistance in the bureaucracy to presidential control. And all of our three candidates will find that. If one were to survey the vast literature on the American presidency, and I could fill this room with books on the subject, I don't claim to have read them all, but I've read a lot of them, you would come up with these principles. First of all, the scholars would tell you that the effectiveness of any president is going to depend on the circumstances he or she faces. The presidency, my friends, is wholly contextual. And if one has a crisis and one deals with it properly, one may have a purchase on greatness in that office. Now, of course, if one faces a crisis and fails, then just the opposite would be the case. But if you're plagued with normalcy, where nothing of great importance happens, you're probably going to be relegated to a rather modest appraisal by professional historians. So the circumstances one faces is so important. And imagine the circumstances that any one of these three is going to face coming in next year. First of all, one thinks of the economy. Do we really believe that any president has the capacity single-handedly to straighten out the American economy? I doubt it. I doubt it. Now, you can hire good people. I personally think the smartest thing Bill Clinton ever did was to hire Mr. Rubin to run the Treasury Department because he was a brilliant Secretary of the Treasury and did some important things to help the economy while he was there. But the economy, you know, one gets the sense has these strong and long cycles that are immutable when it comes to any individual trying to control them. Or take the war in Iraq. I mean, if there's anyone in this room who can tell me what's going to happen there 6 months from now, I'd be very surprised, because I don't think anybody in this room or anywhere else does know for sure. Providence has not given humankind the capacity to pierce the fog of the future. And the greatest dilemma for scholars and policymakers is the uncertainty that always surrounds national security and foreign policy. We could have, and I think there's a 50% chance of this, I would estimate, a civil war in Iraq. Maybe there's a 50% chance as well that the surge will actually lead to a position where we can have some political accords that will actually lead to peace in that country. I don't think we really know, but clearly it's going to be at the very top of the agenda along with the economy for any one of these three. And what we have to find out, search our minds for, I think, in voting, is which of these three would deal best with these various policies, which I hope to come back to. The literature that would fill this room would also tell you that personality is important, which any of us could have guessed, I suppose, without ever reading any books by famous scholars on the presidency. But just let me give you a couple of examples. Take Chester Arthur. I'm sure you were all just thinking about Chester Arthur on the way over here. Chester Arthur is not necessarily our most famous president for good reason. He slept till about 11 in the morning, went horseback riding for 2 or 3 hours, had a leisurely lunch, a couple of glasses of sherry in the afternoon. Oh, I better do some work. Let me sign a couple of letters to foreign heads of state. Oh, that was exhausting. I think I'm getting carpal syndrome. No, maybe they didn't have that back then. So Chester Arthur, because of his turpitude, his lackadaisical approach to the office, really never accomplished much. There are other presidents who have failed us, I think, from the point of view of integrity. I mean, talk about failure. Imagine the people of New York who in good faith elected a man as governor only to find out what a sleazy person he actually was. We can't always find out these things in advance, but they do tell us, they do remind us how important personal integrity is. And we need to search for every clue we can find about the personal characteristics of these people. I personally think high energy is really important. Which of these candidates is going to bring the most energy to the office? They all strike me, frankly, as being rather energetic. Even McCain, who many people complain is too old for the office, I haven't seen evidence of that. He seems healthy and energetic, and so I wouldn't discount him on those grounds. The next factor that people point to is experience. Who's got the best experience for the office, they'll say. And the literature comes down hard on picking someone who is a governor of a leading state in the country. And they usually mean California or Texas, although Texas is a bad example because the governor's powers in Texas are rather weak. So really the best examples are California and New York. If you can succeed in those jobs as a manager, as an inspirational figure, then that's pretty good training to be a president. In contrast, the U.S. Congress may not be, if so goes the argument, because after all, even high-powered senators like Ted Kennedy, who has a staff of 100 people or so, some of it augmented by his own wealth, that's not much of an administrative task to manage 100 people, and most senators manage more like 30 people or 40 people. So if you're governor of California and New York, you get used to dealing with big administrative problems. But I wonder about experience. Let me tell you one of the best prepared individuals I can think of for the American presidency. Look at this resume. Member of the House of Representatives, U.S. Senator, envoy to Russia, envoy to the Far East, Secretary of State. Oh my gosh, I'm salivating because all this guy's got the best credentials. Well, I speak of James Buchanan, the worst president in the history of the United States, as a matter of fact. So be careful about wishing for experienced people because it doesn't always guarantee that they're going to be successful in that office. I talked to you earlier about events and conditions in the world. He was swept over, despite his experiences, by the conditions he faced. Nothing prepared the president to somehow stop the Civil War from breaking out, and certainly he was unable to do that. Then the formal powers. How aggressively will the individual use the formal powers of the office, people ask. And, of course, some presidents have actively used the veto power and other instruments at their behest, and others have been quite passive. So which of these three candidates will aggressively use the powers available? And again, how far does one want a president to be so aggressive in this department? I mean, after all, by now, all of us know about the unitary theory of the president, brought to us by none other than the vice president, Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney has been fighting a battle since the 60s. And that battle is all about retrieving back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue all those presidential powers that eroded away during the 60s and 70s. Now, how did they erode away? They eroded away because, first of all, Watergate happened. And Watergate shattered the notion that presidents can always be trusted. Well, the wise person could simply have consulted Lord Acton or James Madison or the U.S. Constitution to remind themselves of that fact. But those who didn't were certainly reminded by the Watergate scandal. A president involved in criminal activities. And then, along with that, of course, came the Vietnam War. Shattered on the shoals of the Vietnam War is the whole notion that the president knows best when it comes to foreign policy. That used to be the prevailing argument. There was a theory in American politics through most of our history, and it was politics stops at the water's edge. And that catchy little phrase means put your bickering aside when it comes to foreign policy. Fight all you want about domestic policy, health care, education reform, and what have you. But when it comes to our relations with other powers, put your arguments aside. Drop the partisanship. Rally behind the flag and the White House and the nation. Stand united against all our enemies, wherever they may be. Well, it's got a beguiling ring to it, doesn't it, that idea? But the trouble is, presidents can make mistakes. Presidents do make mistakes. And foreign policy, James Madison, how am I doing? Foreign policy cannot be entrusted to one man or one woman alone under our form of government. And then, as if Watergate and Vietnam were not enough, we found out that the CIA, the FBI, the DIA, the NSA, you can go down the list of the intelligence agencies, were spying, yes, against the Soviets. Bravo, that's what they're supposed to be doing. But also against us, the very people they were created to protect. So that with Operation Chaos, Operation Shamrock, Operation Minotaur, don't you love all these innocent-sounding names? Operation COINTELPRO. All these secret acronyms added up to domestic surveillance of American people. Now, who am I talking about? Criminals? Terrorists? No, I'm talking about Vietnam War protesters on the college campuses of the United States. I'm talking about civil rights activists whose sole sin was to seek a better life in America for minority groups. I'm talking about even the Ku Klux Klan, which in our country has the right to state its position as well. I'm talking about domestic surveillance against people whose one sin was to practice their First Amendment rights. And that's what we found out. I was a member of the church committee staff that investigated those activities, and we were shocked and appalled. One of the things we did, by the way, was to write a new law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed in 1978. And that law said, Mr. President, you want to wiretap an American citizen? You better have a good reason for it. And we're creating a special court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and you go to that court, you state in secret, doesn't have to be done openly, you state in secret why you think this American citizen needs to have his phone tapped, or her mail opened, or her dormitory room searched while she's in the library. And if the court, consisting of several judges, agrees with you, then you'll be granted a reward and you can go ahead. Now, why do we do that? to cripple the presidency in his struggle against terrorism? Well, of course not. We did it to maintain our constitutional form of government, to make sure that that power, the awesome power of wiretapping people's cell phones, faxes, emails, was protected. That is to say that only under conditions of probable cause that there was criminal activity involved, that someone was about to commit a crime, did that become permissible. Now, we built into that law a 72-hour provision in which if the president needed to act like that, right away, he or she could. And then come back at the end of the 72 hours and explain why he or she had to move so quickly and get the warrant at that point. So it's not as though we tied the president's hands behind his back or one day her back. We realized that there might be a state of emergency where one would have to move quickly, and we built that into the bill. We also, of course, back in 1978 didn't anticipate all the technological changes that would occur in the country. So now telephone calls between terrorists in Hamburg and Lebanon may go through an American switchboard. And there was some question as to whether or not that would be permissible without getting a warrant to tap those conversations, since no Americans were involved, just two foreigners. And do we want to apply the Fourth Amendment to foreign terrorists? No, I don't think so. So it's easy to fix that. We simply have a technical amendment in that law, which we could pass in one afternoon, saying we realize that now telephone calls between two foreign terrorists may come through America. Wiretapping them is entirely permissible without a warrant. But anytime you're dealing with an American person, you need a warrant for wiretapping. Now, what did the Bush administration do about that? I'm talking about the second Bush administration in the wake of 9/11. They took the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 and threw it out the window, secretly, without anyone knowing. They wiretapped anybody they wanted to. Now, look, we all want terrorists to be wiretapped so we can prevent another 9/11. But keep in mind the history of wiretapping. One day it's wiretapping a terrorist. The next day it's wiretapping your political opponent. The day after that it's wiretapping a BYU student with a bumper sticker of the candidate that you don't like on the back of her car. That's how these things go. It's a slippery slope. And that's why we built a warrant provision into the law. We see here the unitary presidency theory lurking in the White House, thanks to, I think, Dick Cheney. And the idea is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act represents congressional interference in an executive function, protecting the United States against terrorists. That's for the president to do, not the Congress. So Cheney would argue. And therefore, the FISA Act, as it's called, is illegitimate. And we don't have to follow it. So that's the history of the secret effort to undermine the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And as you know, if you read the papers, and I know you do, this is an ongoing debate. And the House right now is holding out for a return to the original 1978 Act. The Senate has been more friendly toward the unitary theory, although still wants a stronger act than Cheney would like. Let me tick off next in my survey of the literature on the presidential powers to give a sense of what these three people will face in the White House, some idea of the limitations on any of them. First of all, consider the limitation of prior commitments. Prior commitments. Every new president coming into the Oval Office faces commitments the United States has already made. Let's say you came into the White House and you wanted to get out of NATO like that. Well, you couldn't do that very easily because we've got commitments to a lot of nations in that treaty organization. Take permissibility. Let's say you came into the White House and the first thing you would do is go down and shoot hoops with Fidel Castro and Raul and buddy up to Cuba. Let's put bygones behind us. Well, how permissible would that be? People would go bananas on Capitol Hill. They would view that as a president engaged in something close to treason, shooting hoops with someone who's been an enemy of the United States. And the American sugar beet industry wouldn't like it either, because once we bring Cuban sugar into America's shores, they face a rather potent competitor. Consider the limitation of resources. There is never, ever enough money to do everything a president would like. How much are we spending in Iraq every day? Every day? Billions of dollars. We're spending $2 billion a week on foreign oil. So we're hemorrhaging money into Iraq and into the oil-producing countries, and we're borrowing credit from China, as you all know. The limitation of resources. Information. There's never enough information. We spend $44 billion a year. $44 billion a year gathering information from around the world using the CIA and 15 other agencies. To put that into contrast, the UK spends $1.2 billion a year gathering global information. We have created the largest information gathering and analysis organization called the intelligence community in the history of civilization. And yet still we didn't know about 9/11 before it hit us. And still we got the WMDs in Iraq wrong. So there's a lot of work a new president has to do to improve the capabilities of our intelligence agencies, and I'm hoping that'll be a big focus of theirs. And then time. Time as a resource. One thinks of the Cuban Missile Crisis. John Kennedy, on day one of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, was advised by his military advisors to invade Cuba. And Kennedy was that close to doing exactly that. And then, thanks to a U-2 flight over the island, we discovered the missiles, through our interpretation of the photographs of them, would not be ready for firing for 2 weeks. Imagine the blessing of a 2-week period of time to sit down and think through Cuba some more. We now know, by the way, after looking at the Soviet archives, that on the ground, unbeknownst to us at the time, were 102 tactical nuclear weapons. We didn't even know they were there. And if we would have invaded, those weapons surely would have been used against American forces. John Kennedy, as he himself said, would then have immediately struck the Soviet Union, and they would have retaliated against us. So we were on the brink of Armageddon, the brink of Armageddon back in October of '62, and it's information about the firing times of the missiles that led to the time that allowed us to come up with a more prudent option, a quarantine. I leave you with these thoughts, and I'll be glad to stick around and talk to you further about them. I think the White House, whoever's in there, any one of those three people, will continue to be in a state of siege as Congress people worry about the violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, about the use of torture, which is tarnishing our name around the world, and other excesses by this executive branch. And journalists throughout America, I think all view themselves as potential Woodward Bernsteins, bringing down a government as they brought down Nixon, winning that Pulitzer Prize and immortality. And so there's a kind of wolf pack mentality among journalists. I don't want to be too negative about them because I think they're a great boon to our freedom. And most of the abuses that occur in government are brought to our attention not by our Congress, which spends more of its time worrying about re-election and raising funds than it does investigating programs that may not be working out, but rather by the press. So my hat is off to the press, but there is this wolf pack mentality that keeps the White House under siege. Then I'd remind you that the iron triangles will be with us forever. The alliance between interest groups, bureaucrats, and legislators who have a cozy relationship regardless of who might be in the White House. Take the area of military weapons production. The Pentagon wants weapons because weapons means more aircraft carriers. That means more stars up here. You can become an admiral if you can get your own aircraft carrier. The Congress people like weapons because they build them in states around the country. That means jobs. And certainly the interest groups, the people who are building the weapons, are making a fortune. That's an example of the iron triangle in the national security domain, and it's difficult for presidents to break through that triangle. The complexity of foreign policy will continue to be with us. The president has the National Security Council to help him think through it, but remember we have 192 nations. Several of them try to hide what they're doing from us in deep underground caverns where they're building atomic bombs. So presidents come to Washington saying, I'm going to deal with the economy, I'm going to deal with domestic policy, and they find themselves forced to concentrate on foreign policy because it's so dangerous to us. John Kennedy once said, you know, if I make a mistake in domestic policy, I may be defeated at the next election. If I make a mistake in foreign policy, the United States may undergo a devastating attack. And then finally, the fragmentation. Here is the great challenge for John McCain, for Obama, and for Mrs. Clinton. How do you make collaborative government work in a system where power is so decentralized and fragmented? And I would suggest to you, you have to make up your own mind, but I would suggest to you often the most the president can do is to be a highlighter, to emphasize a certain direction for the country. And this takes certain rhetorical skills, inspirational skills, and that can be often more important than anything else. I'll end with a quote from Barbara Bush. Barbara Bush has said to me, and I think to many other people, the problem in the United States is not so much in the White House, it's in your house. And by that she meant personally getting involved. You can make a difference. A man was once on his way to Asheville, North Carolina from Georgia, where I live. And he got a little lost, came to a fork in the road, saw an old guy sitting there and said, does it matter which way I go to Asheville? The guy sitting on the road said, not to me it don't. And I'm afraid that's the attitude of a lot of American citizens. It doesn't really matter to them which way this country goes. But I know that's not true at Brigham Young University. Thank you very much. I suppose I apologize for not leaving more time, but I'd be happy to try and answer any questions or hear from you on anything. Yes?
You just wait for the mic and then tell us your name and tell us what you're studying and where you're from.
My name is Liz Mcguire, and I'm an international relations major from Orem, Utah. And I was just wondering, a lot of people would point out that the framers of the Constitution put in the things to make it slow down so that people couldn't make these rash decisions. Do you feel that we've gone beyond that and put in too much bureaucracy, or are we still within the idea that the framers had in the beginning?
I think you make a good point, but I still think we're within the original idea. I mean, presidents can get things done, but you know, it takes patience and it takes cooperation. Thomas Jefferson, when he was in the White House, used to call members of Congress down one at a time for candlelit dinner with him, in which he would personally lobby them. Well, I'm not arguing you can do that with 535 members of Congress today, but you can certainly do a lot more of that. Jimmy Carter, a friend of mine, would bring 125 members of the House down for breakfast. You know, not very personal at all. And I don't think he really understood how to develop rapport on Capitol Hill. I think members of Congress are such patsies. They're like kitty cats. If you stroke them, they begin to do this. So if a president will stroke members of Congress, bring them down, explain what he's trying to do, or she's trying to do, they can often have success. But instead, this administration, I have to tell you, I don't mean this in any partisan sense. I mean, I'm trying to be an objective scholar about this. This is the most secretive administration I've seen since Richard Nixon. And in Washington, they call this slow rolling and stonewalling. But whatever you call it, it adds up to not cooperating with the U.S. Congress, keeping documents from them, not sending up witnesses when they ask for them. That's not the way to get along. You know, our government works best like an engine. An engine works best when all of its cylinders are working. Not just one cylinder, the presidential cylinder. We need all of the cylinders working. And that means presidents reaching out to members of Congress and treating them as a co-equal branch, which in fact they are. And sometimes this can be frustrating because we all know there are a few members of Congress who are irresponsible. But most of them are not. I defy you to go through the list of members of the American Congress, and by and large they are some pretty outstanding people, some of the best people in our local communities. So which of these presidents I want to know is going to approach Congress in a sense of conciliation, a willingness to work in a spirit of comedy with them to solve the problems of the country?
My name is Kelly Jaramillo. I'm a Latin American Studies major here. And I have a question. Out of the three candidates, it seems to me that Obama, like you were saying, is the one that's more willing to buddy up to people like, you know, Castro to Cuba. And you were saying that that can be a very dangerous thing. And so my question is...
I'm saying some people think it can.
Okay.
I personally don't.
Okay.
I'd love to go down and shoot hoops with Raul and Fidel, and I'd do it tomorrow if I thought it would matter. But
well, my question was, you know, do you think it's more dangerous? I think Obama might use this in his slogans, but Kennedy said you should never negotiate out of fear nor fear to negotiate, sort of thing. And do you think it's more dangerous for the United States to look ignorant by not being willing to negotiate with anyone or butting up to people who traditionally we haven't?
I do. I thought Hillary had a point, though. I mean, you don't just suddenly call up the president of Venezuela and say, come on up and let's sit down and have a cup of Kool-Aid and get to know each other. Mm-hmm. But once your staff begins to lay some basic rules and figures out some mutual agreement where you can actually fruitfully come together and have a decent dialogue, that ought to be done as soon as possible. I mean, it's really, you know, a lot of people would disagree with me about this, but when I look back at Fidel Castro in 1959, he overthrew Batista. Batista was one of the most venile right-wing dictators in our hemisphere. And bravo for Fidel for finally getting rid of him. It was a propitious moment, I think, for us to have a relationship with him that could have been very friendly. Instead, we pushed him away and into the arms of the waiting bear called the Soviet Union. And I personally think, having worked with a senator from Idaho for a while, that the U.S. sugar beet industry played a big role there. It's a good example, I think, of the American interest groups driving American foreign policy. They didn't want Cuban sugar in this country. They didn't want good relationships with Cuba.
Well, it's interesting how we'll talk with Musharraf and people, dictators, such as, Musharraf in Pakistan kind of undermines the whole idea of democracy. Yet we choose to have these century-old, say that we don't like Cuba anymore and all these sort of things when we still talk to other people. So it's interesting to me who we choose to talk to and who we don't.
True, although there are some countries like Pakistan where there are really no great choices. I mean, I haven't been impressed by any of the opposition leaders as well, so it's a difficult situation. No matter who you talk to there, you're going to be talking to someone who is probably corrupt or on the take or autocratic to some degree. But even those people we ought to try and get along with as best we can. I mean, I'd like to see a stronger overture even to the Looney Tune leader of North Korea. We need to reach out to these people because when you're talking to people, sometimes good things happen. As Churchill used to put it, jaw, jaw, not war, war.
My name is Drew Chapman. I'm an international relations major from Sacramento, California. And you mentioned something about the election process of the executive office and how you mentioned for a second if it would ever change. Do you think that is plausible? And if it were to change, how would that go about and how would that work?
Well, I think I'm a big fan of national commissions myself, and sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. I'm writing a book on commissions right now, and so I'm into that literature a bit. But I think a national commission to think through how we choose our most important leader would be a timely thing. Get some really distinguished people who could sit on it, men and women who know something about elections, and surely we could do better than the patchwork quilt system we have right now. I mean, I think it is worth asking, why should Iowa and New Hampshire be so special in the process. Maybe we could have regional primaries and rotate every 4 years which region would go first. There are a lot of ideas that have been on the table over the years, but we've never really had a major effort to look at them. But I think most people are kind of unhappy with the process as it's set up now, and I think if we had a serious national commission, sometimes commissions are used just to, blow off a problem, get rid of it. But if we had a serious commission to gather facts and think through how we might design a commission better, or rather an election better in the future, that would be a good thing to do. I mean, look at the case with Florida and Michigan right now. It's absurd, really. So we do a lot of things right, and I still think we have the most robust and interesting democracy in the face of the earth. I still think generally, with all of our warts, our system of elections and governance remains the best, but it's imperfect, and we ought to spend more time thinking about how to elect our leaders.
Last question over here.
My name's Jonathan Spencer. I'm from Pasadena, California, studying poli-sci. I was just curious, out of the Democratic candidates, you said there's a fundamental difference between the two, Hillary being left of center and Obama being a liberal Democrat. Like, in watching the debates, I don't see a difference in their rationale on any issue. Like, it seems that one's an African-American man and one's a white woman, and that's pretty much the difference. They have the same stances on pretty much everything.
I think if you listen to the debates, as you and I have, that you're right, that they seem very close on a lot of issues. I mean, a little down in the weeds on health policy and so on. But that's why empirical indices are important. And that's why I was using the voting records. And if you look at the actual votes, you'll find, the ADA score, Americans for Democratic Action, 100% if you vote liberal on every issue from their point of view, or 0 if you don't. And Hillary really does have a score somewhere in the middle, and Obama's up at 100 with Ted Kennedy. So, but people change. I have to tell you, I've seen presidents. Take LBJ. He had about a 40 ADA rating, but was a pretty darn liberal president, really pushing civil rights. So you can't always go by that. But that's why I said that one is pretty far to the left and one is left center.
Is there any specific indicator that can tell you how they're going to be once elected, or is that just up in the air?
I think generally people don't change that much, so I think what you see now is probably what you're going to get, although dire circumstances can change people. I think George Bush could have cared less about the notion of a unitary presidency, but he was so frightened by the attack on 9/11 that he embraced the rhetoric from his vice president and became a very conservative, hawkish president. So events can change things. But right now, I think you'd have to say that if Obama came in, he'd concentrate on major federal government programs, probably nationalized health care of some kind. And Hillary would be going that direction as well. More sweeping education reform, probably more sweeping than Hillary's would be. So, Democrats are for the use of the federal government to improve the lives of people. Republicans are very suspicious about large governments, even though they spend large amounts of money when they get there, it seems like. And so with Obama, you'd find more federal programs. With McCain, you'd find a lot less. And on the national security dimension, I'm talking about a bona fide hawk. John McCain is about as hawkish as you can get when it comes to the military. And he talks about being in Iraq for 100 years. I doubt if he really meant that, but he might have meant 20 years or 30 years. And if you listen to him on Iran, it's kind of scary too, frankly. I mean, he talks about possible military intervention in Iran. Have you looked at the map comparing Iran to Iraq? Iran's about 4 times the size of Iraq. We can't even manage to quiet things down in Iraq, let alone taking on Iran at the same time. Whereas Obama, I think, probably is a dove. And Hillary, is there such a thing as a dove hawk? An owl, maybe an owl. Maybe she'll be wise and she'll be an owl. One thing that worries me a little bit about a woman in high office, and I personally would love to see one, but sometimes women in high office want to prove that they can be tough. They're women and therefore viewed by a lot of people as being peaceniks and soft. And so some leaders, Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir, have come in there and they've been pretty effective at out-hawking the males. I hope that's not a trap that Hillary would fall into, although she's on record for soon withdrawal from Iraq, so that's not very hawkish. What a pleasure to spend my time with you today. Thank you.